Next, for session 2, I'd like to introduce Alicia Seiger and Mark Roston from the Stanford Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance. Alicia is a lecturer at Stanford Law School and leads sustainability and energy finance initiatives at Stanford Law, Stanford Graduate School of Business, and the Precourt Institute for Energy. She serves as managing director for both the Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance and the Sustainable Finance Initiative. Her work focuses on business and financial innovations to accelerate the transition to a decarbonized, equitable, and climate-resilient global economy. Mark Roston is a research fellow at the Stanford Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance. His research focuses on integrating sustainability risks and opportunities into investment portfolios. Mark has worked in the asset management industry for over 20 years in various senior investment roles in alternative investing, investment strategy, and asset allocation. His prior experience includes serving as a managing director at Silver Creek Capital Management, a $7 billion alternative investment firm based in Seattle, Washington, and as investment manager at MIO Partners, the investment subsidiary of McKinsey & Company. Alicia and Mark have an upcoming white paper that discusses, among other things, current theoretical limits to voluntary carbon markets as currently structured, posing some questions and a few possible answers or directions that the market might go. So I will turn it over to them. Thank you both.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for the nice introduction. Thank you also to the Law School Program Group for putting on this conference today, and to Amy and Francis for a great introduction. That was not an easy task to cover all that landscape in 30 minutes, so appreciate that start. One thing you may have noticed in Sam's introduction is, despite the fact that both Mark and I have titles in academia, we are not academics. Mark does have the PhD in economics from University of Chicago, but as you heard, has 25 years of experience in the asset management industry. And just fun fact in my bio that Sam didn't read, I was actually the first employee at TerraPass back in 2004, 2005. So the high watermark of the voluntary carbon market I saw in the chart earlier that Amy showed was 790 million. So that was a long time ago, and a lot has changed. A couple just background points on why we're here. Our research team last year published a book called Settling Climate Accounts: Navigating the Road to Net Zero, in which we explored the rough edges of net zero in practice and identified what we saw as 4 unsettled accounts for the road ahead that needed some course corrections to arrive at our target destination of climate stability. Those accounts we categorized as data, boundaries, timing, and obligations. But you can think of it, for the context of this conversation, as scope 3 and offsets. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to dive into it. Before we get there, though, let me just also articulate how we go about our research agenda. So we engage with leading corporate and financial institutions, and through that engagement, what we're really seeing is a need to reconcile a discord that these institutions are facing in conforming to recognized climate practices that signal their commitment, but don't clearly add up to effective climate outcomes. And so in our next phase of research, building on the work of the book, we're taking this a multi-layered approach of nestled projects that you can think of in 3 categories: that's diligence, reform, and reset. So this diligence piece starts with a grounded investigation of existing practices. The reform piece is the idea that there's opportunities, and we are investigating and designing them to reform existing rules and standards. But in some cases, while reform is often the only path forward in the near term, our team's also investigating what we're calling sort of fundamental resets of principles and precedents. And these resets that we identify are likely necessary in areas where even collective reforms of accepted practice arguably will carry actors further in a mistaken direction. And so these reforms and resets aren't worth the paper they're written on unless they become real. So our work also involves engagement with key stakeholders. We workshop ideas, design pilots, and build paths to implementation. So with that sort of backdrop of how we go about our work, the topics we'll cover today are focused again on these unsettled accounts of scope 3, suggesting needs a reset. And the area of our investigation into carbon markets suggests significant reform to build market integrity. The good news is both can be accomplished if we move from carbon counting to carbon accounting. So Zoom conferences can be a little dull, but we're going to keep things interesting and lively today. And to bring our research to life, we're going to zoom into the future. So you may not have noticed here, but Mark is actually joining us from October 25th, 2030. I don't know if you can tell in his background. What's amazing is he hasn't aged at all in 8 years. It's remarkable, Mark. And I do have lots of questions about the future that I'd love to ask you, but I'm going to stick to the topics at hand. So let's just start with the first question. So here in 2022, the voluntary carbon market is it logging 2 billion this year. How big is the voluntary carbon market out there in 2030, Mark?
Oh, it's huge. It's enormous. We're going to say, let's call it 100 billion.
Wow. 2x even McKinsey's forecast.
Yes. McKinsey's underestimating the potential. Dramatically underestimating the potential.
Love it. Okay, so wow. So what were some precipitating events that got the world on track to 100 billion in voluntary carbon market after COP27?
So it was mostly bad news. A number of things went very wrong in carbon markets. The first thing that went wrong was the worst fire season on record in northern and southern hemisphere. As Carbon Plan has noted in the past, the buffer pools are running low in the California compliance markets, and the fire seasons were so bad that buffer pools were wiped out across the board. And at the same time, as countries have been targeting or committing to their own net zero plans, they've been finding, particularly in developing markets, that selling off their offsets was a really bad idea. So they've nationalized them. They've basically said all of these things that we sold, that these projects that were sold, the country's just saying, nope, it's unwound. This is our land, and we're taking the offsets back. And the result was a whole bunch of litigation. There was well, I can't say protracted because it's only 2030. There was litigation by climate activists against some companies that were big supporters of climate action by basically saying, you spent all this money on offsets that reversed, you didn't do anything about it, and so we're suing you for having lied, essentially somewhere between lying and fraud over your offset purchases. The unfortunate news is the company won because the offset commitment, all of the offset purchases were just sort of booked as expenses, whether that was charitable expense or advertising expense. It just didn't matter. There wasn't anything on the balance sheet. There was no loss to the company. The company did what it said it was going to do. At the same time, some, let's call it climate opposed activist attorneys general, essentially made the opposite argument, saying you were wasting shareholder money. What the heck were you doing buying these things that aren't real? And they also lost because the company said it was an advertising expense. So everyone realized that there was not much really going on here with these carbon offsets because no one was actually long-term responsible for them on their own balance sheets.
That sounds bad. How did we pull out of that tailspin?
We pulled out of that tailspin by requiring actual accounting for carbon exposures. So I think the best way to think about that is, as Frances noted in her introduction, protecting the rainforests, protecting tropical forests amount to taking on responsibility for avoiding what is Scope 1 emissions when forests are lost. And what's going on in voluntary carbon transactions is no one is actually, the buyer is not actually taking on an obligation to protect against those carbon emissions. There isn't a long-term transfer of responsibility and obligation. There's a moral transfer. of responsibility and obligations. That's why we're all here, to say we're trying to fix this problem and we're trying to do what's right. But the simple fact is that right now, companies who buy carbon offsets are not legally speaking bound or financially bound to ensure the long-term durability of those offsets.
Okay, so that's interesting. I want to understand this a little better. I heard you say carbon balance sheets. What are, it sounds simple but also hard. What are carbon balance sheets, and how do they solve this problem of scaling voluntary carbon markets?
Sure. So the goal here is really that we arrived at a point where a company has a long-term liability that is on a corporate balance sheet that requires them to manage their carbon exposure. So I think the best analogy here is really to think about defined benefit plans, so long-term retirement plans for companies. So when a company has a defined benefit plan, they have a very specific obligation that's carefully managed and regulated and overseen by national governments that say, all right, we have to have independent evaluation and an independent understanding of what your long-term liabilities are to pay benefits to your, employees and retirees, and you have to have assets that manage that. So what we're talking about is saying a company has to maintain an understanding of their emissions into the atmosphere, which amounts to a near permanent liability to the company. And we have to figure out a framework that says, how much capital do we require to manage that risk? How do we offset that liability with carbon offsets? And how do we manage the risk of those offsets? And again, to point to some of the earlier comments, today what we have is a problem that we're sort of stumbling in the dark to understand what it means to have a long-term obligation to these offsets and long-term obligation to maintaining the carbon.
All right. Well, while we wait for Mark to return, let me connect the dots on some of the comments Mark was starting to make about carbon balance sheets by painting the picture of the liability side before we get into the contra liability and the assets, which is where the carbon offsets come into play. And the way that side of the balance sheet could get built is actually ties back to the comments I made earlier about scope 3, where a company's emissions and understanding of its emissions would be a measurement of the scope 1 emissions of every entity in its supply chain passed down at the point of sale, where they add their own scope 1 plus the scope 1 of the entity upstream. Here's Mark.
In the future, Wi-Fi still sucks when you're traveling.
I made
it hasn't been resolved.
Joke.
Okay, good to know.
I was starting to explain e-liabilities while tap dancing. So perhaps we can start there, because I've now opened that can of worms. To help us to conceive what this carbon balance sheet is. What do you mean by a carbon balance sheet?
Yeah, so a company produces its products, they are being passed, just like they get passed, the cost of their products through their supply chain. They get passed an invoice that says, here's how much carbon liability you inherited when you bought these products. So it's really no different than a cost accounting exercise. It's, here's a receipt for how much you paid, and here's a receipt for how much carbon obligation you just took on. And then a company has to decide, are they going to retain that carbon on their balance sheet, or are they going to pass that carbon down to their customers? And their customers, much like activists today, are demanding carbon-free products or carbon-free companies. They will continue to do that. But in this case, rather than saying I manage my carbon flow on a year-to-year basis, a company that wants to deliver carbon-free products, or a company that wants to say it has a it hits its net zero target, is on the hook long-term for managing the fact that they're sitting on these carbon liabilities and they have an obligation to manage the carbon assets that match their liabilities.
And can you just take a second to connect e-liabilities with scope 3?
Sure. So e-liabilities look an awful lot like a slightly stripped down version of scope 3. So one of the most difficult complications with scope 3 is that it deals with downstream in the supply chain. It's extremely hard to identify accurately. Most people rely on industry estimates, and that's problematic, especially when you start to think about moving into a regime that actually requires doing something about it as opposed to reporting it. So even if we could figure out how to accurately calculate scope 3 emissions, it's a huge leap to say that any regulatory body is going to compel a company to manage something over which it has no control. So what we're saying is, let's look upstream, let's get the numbers correct upstream, and those liabilities sit with the company that incurs the liability, and then they have to manage that liability.
Okay, so I'm a big company. I've now built out my e-liabilities calculations through understanding my supply chain like I have in my cost accounting system. But what you're saying to me is that liability has a duration that I've not taken into account previously. And then I have to figure out a mechanism to balance that liability through some sort of asset or contra liability.
Right. So for example, take forestry offsets. And what does it mean for a forest offset to be permanent? This varies depending on the agent who's claiming something is permanent. The simple fact is none of them are consistent with the idea that the carbon is essentially in the atmosphere permanently. There's some arguments to be made about seawater absorption, but that's basically swapping an atmospheric externality for an ocean externality. So the carbon's around forever. If you emit the carbon, it's around forever. And so you have to have your feet to the fire, so to speak, to be responsible for ensuring that that carbon that you're removing has been removed forever. And we can get into details about what does forever really mean? How long is forever? But the difficulty right now is that under most concepts of using offsets and net zero targeting, I'm dealing with flows. If I offset my 2022 emissions with 2022 offsets, I'm not really financially on the hook if in 2030 my 2022 offsets all reverse on me. It's sort of water under the bridge under current accounting practice. And that means that, no CEOs are getting fired. No CFOs are, being told you signed off on completely misleading financial statements because you committed to carbon neutrality and you didn't actually deliver it in the future.
Okay, so this is starting to make sense to me, but I want to get a better understanding of pricing. So you've got a balance sheet now. You're saying that this was the magic tool that was missing. But how does the balance sheet translate into pricing, and how does that relate to scaling markets?
Okay, so one of the examples we talk about in our work is that we can point to very few things that are absolutely clearly additional and permanent. And one of those is, for example, direct air capture with mineralization. If you can actually sell someone rocks that have been made out of CO2 that have no purpose, it's a rock, it's permanent, and it's presumably underground, so no one's using it for something else. So it meets those criteria. That's a very expensive thing to do right now. But basically, everything else that gets traded in the offset market is riskier in terms of reversal, and it's riskier in terms of additionality and riskier in terms of leakage. leakage. So when we're talking about this notion of sorting through all of the accountability for risk in a trading system, what we have to do is understand how to price those differences. And today we are not we're not adequately trying to price those differences and understand those different risks. What the market is doing today is saying, well, if we can measure it, then we're going to treat it as a fungible commodity. The challenge and this gets into really detailed operations of commodities markets that, as our introduction, when Amy spoke in the introduction, she explained this took a long time to sort out in other financial markets, is how do you draw tight links between what are called physical settlement commodities and cash settlement commodities. It's very hard to work out in detail, but that's what provides market integrity. And so one of the challenges we face today is drawing those connections between financial market integrity in terms of trading and exchanging commodities, which are treating carbon as a tradable commodity. And we're not quite there because the counterparty risks are frankly not very uniform. Different projects have different failure probabilities that don't get priced. Different registries have different rules that aren't distinguishing in price. And so the idea of saying one is as good as the other is very hard to justify right now, because when a project fails, what are we doing if some projects that fail are more creditworthy than others to be replaced?
Okay, so I'm sorry, we've got to be efficient here on time. Let me just try and summarize, and then I've got one last question. So we've got, what you're telling me is what we figured out is we created a carbon accounting system where we measured carbon, actual carbon emissions that went up in the atmosphere once and only once through a supply chain. So we had a real number that could then be balanced with a contra liability or an asset that created a robust carbon market with real trading with permanence, where quality wasn't the question, it was duration, and that was priced accordingly. We figured out how to price that. We figured out title. We figured out counterparty risk. That also had the benefit of creating alignment between ledgers. So we had corporate ledgers that aligned with country ledgers that aligned, with global ledgers. And this, as I understand it, also had an impact on actual cost of capital and really started to transfer capital into decarbonization at scales we hadn't seen before. That all sounds fantastic. What I just want to know from here, what was the first step? How did we start doing this in a meaningful way?
The first step was carbon balance sheets. That as soon as we came up with an accounting structure that would essentially tag a company forever with its carbon emissions and hold them accountable for it, then the process just sort of, frankly, it flows from that. If you hold a company accountable for its carbon emissions on a balance sheet, and they are responsible for maintaining that liability and offsetting that liability, then that's what drives it. That drives up the cost of capital to the people who have larger emissions. It incentivizes reducing emissions because you don't want to incur the liabilities in the first place. That's what we're all here trying to do in a entirely voluntary way today. But one of the great challenges is, how do you make this material? You have to get it out of an advertising framework from an accounting. You have to make this, I must account for this and I'm responsible for it for a very long time. It's not just an expense I incur today and I'm done with it.
Okay, great. Well, Mark, I really appreciate you joining us from the future. I'm sure you have lots of other things going on.
Yeah, I'm stock trading.
But I hope you enjoyed your visit to the past. And I see there are a lot of questions in the Q&A. We will type them in. I'm sorry we can't get to them all live, but I know it's very important to keep on time on these things. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sam. And thanks again, Mark.
Appreciate it, Mark and Alicia. I love the thought experiment. And Mark, thank you for sharing your wisdom from the future. Yeah, please, both of you do feel free to hop in on the Q&A in the chat. There were lots of good questions that popped up there. For everybody, we've got another couple hours of programming, so we're just going to take a 3-minute break now to the top of the hour. So feel free to come back then, and we will get going with our third session. Thank you.